Chapter 4, Puerto Rico. I got talked into making my unofficial debut in Saskatoon on May 2, 1978. Stu was one wrestler short, and it was as simple as that. Being green here wouldn't hurt the ring rep I needed to build as a heart in Calgary. I'd appear before the usual crowd of about 100 fans, which consisted mostly of busloads of mentally challenged kids, a handful of diehards and a few drunks. I would tag up with an old veteran wrestler named Patty Ryan, a thick, rugged Mick, as big and round as a cement truck. All I really needed to do was sell, make it look like my opponents were getting the better of me, which would be easy since Patty and I would be working with Hito and Sakurada. I walked out that night pale, skinny and cold, and Hito and Sakurada kicked and slammed me so hard I thought I'd really pissed them off. After the match they praised me, explaining, "Stiff okay." For the handful of dedicated fans who knew I was normally just a referee, and that I was a rookie, it was necessary to protect the business, keep it real. Stiff was as real as it got. After the matches that night, I relaxed at the hotel bar drinking draft with Patty Ryan and was more than proud of myself. It meant a lot to me when an old fan came by and said, "Hey, Hart, you done good out there tonight." That same trip, a new wrestler from England was making his first loop around the territory. Bruce had discovered Tom Billington, raving that he was the most incredible wrestler he'd ever seen. Billington called himself the Dynamite Kid. At that time, the business was filled with big, heavy men. Dynamite stood a mere 5'8" and was lucky if he weighed 170 pounds. He was 2 years younger than I was, with a pale, angular face and sandy blonde hair. Out of the ring, he wore mod Brit clothes. In the land of ring giants, he suffered from small man's complex, which would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was clean-cut and he didn't smoke or drink, yet. None of the big heels wanted to work with him, let alone put him over, and he looked like he was sorry he'd ever let Bruce talk him into coming to work for our dad. But he said nothing. Always the professional, Cuban finally obliged and put Dynamite over for his debut week, a favor Tom would never forget. I watched him do a match filled with fancy flips and rolls, stuff that I doubted I could ever do, and thought I'd like to work with him one day and learn what I could. But he kept his distance. A week later, Keith made the trip to Regina and asked me whether I could fill in again, working a simple babyface match against Patty Ryan. Knowing Patty's experience and style, I had little to worry about. But the card was switched around at the last minute because Dynamite's opponent, Steve Novak, a big, bearded 280-pound slob, refused to work with him, let alone put him over. Keith had no choice but to match me up with Dynamite. I had already worked out a nice paint-by-numbers match with Patty and knew I was nowhere near experienced enough to go out and do Dynamite's Brit style of flips and rolls. "Keith, you promised me Patty. Maybe you should wrestle Dynamite? You have a lot more experience than I do." Dynamite took it the wrong way, thinking I didn't want to work with him either, and Keith stood firm. I laced up my bright red boots and pulled on my red trunks, all the while talking to Dynamite about the one or two things that I didn't know how to do. If I thought he was grateful for my honesty, I was wrong. Dynamite stiffed me from bell to bell, to the delight of the fans. For no apparent reason, he elbow smashed me in the face and broke my nose. The blood probably saved the match. I blamed the bad match on the situation, not on myself. But I also felt that he was less than professional and vowed to be a bit more careful the next time we worked together. A couple of days later, Smith and Bruce were talking over their upcoming trip to Puerto Rico. Bruce suddenly had a change of heart about going with Smith, but the plane tickets had already been purchased by the promoter, and they were both expected to be there. What I didn't know was that my parents had arranged the trip to get Smith out of their hair for a while. A few years earlier they'd sent him off to Japan to learn how to wrestle. They thought a good dose of Japanese discipline wouldn't hurt either. He lived in a dojo and was forced to train hard. The Japanese were the toughest, most serious teachers in wrestling. He was ordered to clean and scrub down the mats and to wash the backs of his superiors, who beat the backs of his legs with a bamboo stick when he failed to do 1,000 squats as ordered. Every time he called begging to come home, my parents told him to hang in there. 9 months into it, Smith had got really drunk on Sakai and run buck naked through a Japanese hotel lobby and crashed right through a plate glass window. The Japanese police were looking everywhere for him as two equally crazy wrestlers from New Zealand, known as the Kiwis, hit him in their hotel room. Smith was shipped home the next day. He couldn't have been happier. My parents couldn't have been unhappier. They'd wanted Smith out of their hair a while longer. I think that one trip to Japan destroyed what little spirit was left in Smith's tortured soul. He was never really the same after that. Bruce didn't trust the setup in Puerto Rico. So he suggested I take his place. Times were simpler then and the plane tickets simply said S. Hart and B. Hart. I'd heard the Puerto Rican horror stories. A kid from Edmonton called Kim Cloquet who broke in with my older brothers, had a black belt in karate. He went to Puerto Rico as a big, blonde 250-pound heel, and when he made his debut, the crowd went berserk and rioted. Kim wasn't afraid of much. He climbed the corner post and dove into the fans only to have one of them carve a giant L in his guts with a knife. He was lucky to leave there with his life, and he never wrestled again. Smith pleaded with me to go. A few hours later we were on a plane heading for Puerto Rico. My dad had given the Puerto Rican promoters, Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica, their first break in the business, and they'd stayed with him for 5 years. Colon was a great worker and had a good mind for the business. Once upon a time he'd been a handsome kid, now his forehead was scarred with thousands of razor cuts, and he was as ugly as they came. I vividly remember the great bloody matches he had with Abdullah the Butcher. Colon's business partner, Victor Jovica, was a horrible wrestler, but he'd built up a nest egg from various investments. The two of them had put their heads together and hatched a dream of opening their own wrestling company in Puerto Rico, Capital Wrestling. They were on the brink of folding for good when they shot an angle using a veteran Stampede wrestler from Thunder Bay called Bad Boy Gilbert Hayes, pitting him against Terrible Ted, the wrestling bear. To their utter amazement it popped the territory, and Bad Boy Gil became their hottest heel. They never looked back after that, and Puerto Rico became a gold mine. Once they started making money, the WWF tried to steal the territory away from them, but eventually they feared no one, not even WWF owner Vince McMahon Sr. then Gil, who had more balls than brains, had a falling out with Colon, and threatened to walk. Carlos beat him nearly to death in the dressing room. Puerto Rico was a dangerous place to work if you were a heel because the fans were so hot-blooded. The promotion employed mostly Latin American and American wrestlers who couldn't get booked stateside, or anywhere else, along with the occasional big-name WWF headliner. Stu often traded talent with Jovica and Colon because neither he nor the Puerto Ricans paid much. Puerto Rico could be murderous, while Calgary could be murderously cold. But we thought Carlos and Victor would take good care of Stu's boys. There was no one to greet us when we arrived in San Juan. We had little money and no idea where to go until the Capital Wrestling office opened in the morning. Smith and I slept on the filthy airport floor using our bags as pillows. Once we checked in with the office, we ended up at the Dynamite Hotel, a dump where only the bottom-end wrestlers stayed. Smith and I were each making US $300 a week, and I was intent on getting back to Calgary with enough money to put a down payment on a house of my own. The Dynamite was a real shithole situated across a river from an overcrowded prison full of violent criminals. The air conditioning in our room didn't work, and we were too naive for it to occur to us to change rooms. We relied on the ceiling fan, which didn't work too well either, so we opened our windows and slept fitfully every night in the sweltering heat, listening to sirens from the prison and vicious fights among the prostitutes on the street below our windows. The very first night we heard what sounded like gunshots and somebody groaning. I was too scared to look. All the while the steady thumping beat of salsa music and Barry Manilow singing Copacabana drifted up from the disco joints. What had I got myself into? My second mistake, after the one about agreeing to come, was thinking I should stay away from Latin food and water. I walked down to a Burger King to get some American food, where I met a friendly Puerto Rican kid who introduced himself as Kikai. He spoke good English and he wanted to take me to a fiesta. I told him I couldn't leave my brother behind, so he came back to the Dynamite with me. Off we all went to a small carnival with Ferris wheels. Smith said Kikai was dying to get into my pants, but I should be nice to him because it might be useful to know someone who had a car. I didn't believe it. Our room was an oven, and by morning I was drenched in sweat, and sick with the runs. By the time our ride picked us up for our first show, I was weak and dizzy. Luckily, Chief Thundercloud and his son Chewy both spoke English and had a cheap but reliable car. Chewy was a few years older than I was, but he was too small to wrestle. All the way to Ponce I fought not to shit my pants right there in the car. To my dismay, the highways were littered every 100 feet or so with dead dogs that had their legs pointing straight up in the air. The narrow, winding road added to my nausea. My match was with a big American by the name of Mike York, a heavy-set clodhopper of a wrestler who had a thick, black beard and hair all over his body. The ring wasn't covered with canvas but with cheap, slippery blue vinyl, made more hazardous by puddles of sweat mixed with baby oil, the residue of previous matches. Mike was a clumsy freight train, but he did all he could to take care of me. Hito had been right. I just started doing all the moves I'd seen, including an explosive comeback. But as I found myself jumping up to hit Mike with a drop kick, my feet hit a slippery spot and I crashed down on my shoulder. "I'm hurt, Mike," I said. "We better go home." To end the match, he got me onto my feet, grabbed me, spun me upside down and gave me a shoulder breaker across his knee. I knew I was in good hands because he dropped me on my good shoulder. Then he covered me and panted in my ear, "Sorry, brother, thanks for the match." I headed back to the dressing room, holding my shoulder, as the crowd gave me a round of applause. Damn it. What lousy luck to get hurt my first night. When I told Carlos, he simply said, "You're tough," as he chomped on a cigar. He expected Smith and me to hit the ring in the main event that night to help save him and another Puerto Rican wrestler from some heels. I said I'd do whatever I could, and I wandered out to the concession stand to find some ice for my shoulder. Stu Hart's kid or not, nobody gave a damn about me here. I clamped a leaky bag of ice to my shoulder and was standing in agony next to Smith when somebody yelled, "On delay. On delay. On delay." The place suddenly went insane. I started for the ring, and then I stopped. "I'm not getting killed out there." Smith agreed. The arena floor was a tangle of rioters and police beating them back with batons. Chairs flew through the air like rain, and Carlos and his partner were covered in blood, begging for mercy as they were clobbered by two heels, Frenchie Martin and Fidel Castillo, who had steel chains wrapped around their fists. People were crying real tears. Finally, to everyone's relief, the masked invader arrived on the scene, and in seconds he was helping Carlos and his partner fight their way back through the sea of people. As Frenchie and Fidel came toward me, their eyes were wild and filled with terror. They held metal chairs over their heads like shields as irate fans lunged at them. I didn't see any knives, but I knew they were out there, and I could hear metal clanging off the chairs as the fury of the fans boiled over. In the midst of the riot, I noticed a young, blonde American couple wearing Bermuda shorts and golf shirts, and holding hands, immobilized by the fights raging around them. The referee, a quiet little fellow called Hammer, was also fighting for his life, blindly swinging a steel chair, deflecting unidentified flying objects and attacking fans. He was backing his way toward the two Americans. My first instinct was to intervene, but they were more than 30 feet away, and I would never have made it. Hammer swung full force as he turned, smashing his chair over the blonde man's head. The man fell to the floor, his girl beside him, helpless and terrified. Now I understood why Bruce had stayed home. Back in the hotel room, Smith was sick too, and we took turns racing to the toilet and sweating on our grungy beds. My shoulder was killing me, and I couldn't raise my arm. Tiny gnats landed on us incessantly. They seemed harmless enough, so we just rubbed them out. The street sounds filtered up, sirens wailed, and it turned out the little gnats weren't so harmless after all. For weeks we were covered in festering boils. Smith and I took turns with a pair of tweezers plucking at the eruptions on our arms and chests, leaving big pink craters. Because of my shoulder, I had no choice but to miss a full week of bookings until I recovered. Smith went on alone. I went one more time to the pharmacia. I'd already tried everything they'd told me to do, and I pleaded with the chemist, saying that I was very ill. I was skin and bones compared to when I'd left home. He felt sorry for me and gave me some white pills in a small paper bag, enough for Smith and me. I thanked him and paid him. I have no idea what kind of pills they were, but I was so desperate I took them anyway. When the week was over, I had no choice but to go to work again. I told Smith to let Jovica and Cologne start booking me, but only in tag matches for now. Smith found some marijuana, which helped our dysentery. High as a kite, I drew caricatures of some of Smith's fucked up friends from back home. It felt good to see him laugh. We hit the beach in our free time, and stayed in the sun too long. We were ill, we were taking bumps every night, we couldn't sleep, the sunburn was just one more thing. But we didn't take any more chances with food. The upscale La Concha Hotel, a few blocks away, catered to American tourists. They had an all-you-can-eat buffet that opened at noon. At US $18 a head, it was pricey for us, but the food was worth every penny. Every day, we'd wait until they opened, and we'd gorge. Smith would stuff himself. For my amusement, he'd struggle to his feet holding his hand to the seat of his pants, then stagger to the men's room while the tuxedoed waiters fell over laughing. He would come out smiling 10 minutes later, flailing his arms and doing deep knee bends, and then he'd grab another plate, load it up and head back to our table. The waiters and I would be in tears. Soon Smith met a beautiful, hot-tempered Puerto Rican girl named Maria, after she cursed him out in Spanish one day on the beach. Before long he was talking to her, drawing diagrams in the sand, explaining how there were 10 Cadillacs parked around the big house where he lived with his rich and famous father. Maria warmed to him, but of course he failed to tell her that most of the caddies didn't run, and that none of them were his. I had a nice dark tan now, and I wore my black Bull Rider cowboy hat everywhere I went. At night, I'd wander past the prostitutes as I headed for the beach. The moon lit my way as I followed the black rocks that stretched out into the ocean. Waves washed over little crabs scurrying on the sand, and big ships blinked their red lights in the distance. I'd sit out on the rocks, drink a carton of orange juice, treat myself to a chocolate bar, eat bananas and wonder what my friends back home would think of what I was doing. I'd been doing a great job of pretending to get the shit kicked out of me, rolling around in pain, reaching out desperately to Smith, fighting back just enough to get cheers from the fans. I realized that I had a knack for it, and I was determined to be the best loser Puerto Rico had ever seen. I could be great if I wanted to be. The fans told me so with their eyes. The truth about these fans is that they had great sympathy and emotion because they really believed. They loved their wrestling so much that they could, and would, kill you without remorse if you offended them or let them down. I had the pleasure of meeting the legendary Bruno Sammartino, the former WWF champion. He was really nice and even posed for a picture with Smith and me. But I have to say that I didn't think he was anywhere near the worker that Dory Funk Jr. or Harley Race was. I was disappointed in the cage match he had with Gorilla Monsoon. If the same match had played out in front of the Calgary fans, they would have booed the two of them out of the building. In their defense, I was well aware that Sammartino's New York wrestling style sold out Madison Square Garden every month, but it was probably the phoniest wrestling anywhere. To see realistic wrestling, you went to Japan, or to Calgary, St. Louis, Kansas City, Amarillo, Minneapolis, even Portland or Louisiana. I didn't know how or when or where I learned these things, but I knew they were true. Gorilla Monsoon was a nice guy. His real name was Robert Gino Morella, and he had the kindest things to say about Stu. When I mentioned this to Stu on the phone, he told me he had trained the 350-pound gorilla in the dungeon back in 1961. Gino had been undefeated as an amateur wrestler, and was the only wrestler on the U.S. national team whom the Russians couldn't take off his feet. Stu chuckled about how he had cross-faced Gino down in the basement, locking his arm and pressing down on his shoulder, forcing the gorilla to the mat and bloodying his nose. The big bastard was pretty hard to contain after that, Stu said. I was learning that pro wrestling wasn't all fake and could be very painful. I had a match with King Kong, a 5'2", 350-pound human boulder from Argentina, who did a belly flop and landed on me like a slab of concrete, knocking all the wind out of me. To him, I was just a piece of meat. I never gave him the satisfaction of letting him know he had hurt me. Afterwards, in the dressing room, King Kong shook my hand and said gracias. He stood as high as my nipples. I smiled down at him thinking, fuck you, fatso. It was all part of paying my dues. In Puerto Rico, I understood for the first time the creativity and the drama required to be a great worker, the art of making it all seem real and telling a story using my body. I would show them all someday. Out on the rocks, I made a pact with the full moon, asking God to watch over me as I decided to dedicate my life to this crazy profession. Smith began socializing with a notorious New York wrestler by the name of Dick Steinborn. He was the son of Mila Steinborn, a wrestler from my father's era. Dick was to his respected father as Smith was to Stu. As a wrestler, Dick bordered on genius and at the time was rated as the best junior heavyweight in the business. But he was equally renowned for sketchy maneuvers. Dick took Smith under his wing and the two of them sat for hours drinking beer, conjuring up scams. Kikai came around from time to time. One night he took Smith, Maria and me to a strip bar. A beautiful bronze dancer came over to me and she seemed very interested. I was bedazzled by her long hair and the dark curves of her body. I asked Kikai to tell her that I thought she was beautiful. His face turned red and he rattled on in Spanish. She left the table abruptly and never returned. Months later, Maria told me Kikai had made it clear that I was taken by him. Kikai never tried anything, but I always sensed that he wanted to ask me something but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Back in the lobby at the Dynamite, Smith was propositioned by two teenage prostitutes who were sucking red lollipops and wearing tight red dresses. He was happy courting Maria, so, like a good big brother, he negotiated on my behalf. I wasn't sure I was interested, although they were very pretty. Smith haggled and said, I got her down to $10. I dug into my jeans. All I've got is 8. We called home every Sunday. I told Stu how much I hated it, and he told me to ride it out. Smith and I decided to leave at the end of June, stopping in New York to visit my mom's sister, Aunt Joni, before going back to Calgary. When Smith broke the news to my mom, she asked him to put me on the phone and promptly broke down in tears. Please, darling, you can't let Smith get anywhere near your Aunt Joni. Please promise me. My mom's relatives thought their Canadian cousins were the picture-perfect family, the Kennedys of Canada. Mom thought that Smith would expose in a few moments an image that had taken years to cultivate. Without giving her away, I said, Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of it. I promise. That night there were too many heels winning matches, so the hapless Hart brothers were going to go over. It didn't mean much to anyone else, but I was excited, especially because it was an honor for me to wrestle at Roberto Clemente Stadium. The Pittsburgh Pirate had been a sports hero of mine until he died in a plane crash when I was 15. I thought this night would be one that I'd tell my children about someday. The stadium was packed, and the buzz of the crowd was electric. As we waited to make our entrance, I noticed two pea-sized spiders, red as little tomatoes, perched above me on opposite sides of the doorway, having a stare down. Suddenly they charged each other, colliding and dropping in front of me on a single thread, dangling and spinning furiously. I said to Smith, "Maybe they're fucking," and then I realized it was a fight to the death. It lasted a full minute, until one spider wrapped the other in a silk coffin. Those two spiders turned into a symbol of my time in Puerto Rico, where death was always hanging in the air. Smith scored the win with a sloppy sunset flip in front of a sold-out stadium full of roaring fans. I was surprised when they rose to their feet, jumping and cheering for us. Smith really overdid it, throwing his fist high in the air and shouting like a girl, jumping around me, humping my leg. We won. We won. He was a nut, but I loved him for it. We would leave Puerto Rico on July 2nd, my 21st birthday. Victor insisted that because of everything Stu had done for him and Carlos, he would treat Smith and me to lunch before we left. I wouldn't know until I got home that I lost 25 pounds in Puerto Rico. All I knew was that I was grateful for his offer. I'd been trying to talk Smith out of visiting Aunt Joni, so I was relieved and amused when he came to me with a plan. He'd met a pasty-faced platinum blonde out by the small, filthy hotel swimming pool which had a dead rat floating in it the whole time we were there. She invited Smith and me to stay at her well-to-do parents' dairy farm, just outside Chicago. So, instead of New York it would be Chicago, and I kept my promise to my mom, sort of. Smith and I arrived by taxi in time for lunch with Victor. We were famished, because we'd skipped our usual feast at the La Concha. After we'd waited for nearly an hour, Victor came out of his office with his car keys jingling in his hand. "Sorry, boys, no time today. We'll do it another time. I'm busy. Got to go." We walked all the way back to the hotel, missed the buffet and never did eat that day. On the Wednesday before we were to leave, we did TV tapings at a studio in Bayamon. It always seemed to be pouring down buckets of rain, yet it was never cool, always hot and sticky. The town reminded me of a short, wet crying scene from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. There was a 6-year-old albino kid who hung around the studio with sad, hungry eyes. I remember him running away as fast as he could, screaming, being chased by a cockroach as big as a mouse. It seemed to be gaining on him as they ran down a muddy street. I was sick and tired of the heat and the squalor. I vowed never to complain about the Calgary cold again and began counting the seconds until the flight. Then Smith had a change of heart. He'd fallen in love with Maria and was going to hang on for a while longer. I was happy for him, but I was out of there. Smith and I teamed up for a 6-minute TV match with Frenchie Martin and Michelle Martel, the hottest heel team the territory had ever known. We were going to get squashed, which was fine by us. I liked Frenchie and Michelle, and I was happy to do my small part in helping them get over. I took my usual shit kicking and tagged in Smith. He was hoping to shine ever so slightly in case Maria saw the match on TV, though I doubted she could afford a TV. Michelle and Frenchie ate Smith alive, slapping and kicking him, leaving red marks all over his chest. Smith was annoyed at their obvious potatoes, and they could barely refrain from laughing as they tagged in and out to dish out more punishment. Smith sulked about it for the rest of the night. I was standing in the dugout in Ponce watching when Michelle Martel dropped to one knee and gripped his chest. Something was wrong, for real. Frenchie worked the rest of the match and took the fall. He slung Michelle's arm over his neck and carried him back to the heel dressing room, doing his best to protect Michelle from the flying debris. Frenchie laid him out in the shower, letting the cold water run over him, and he suddenly sat up and said he was fine, chalking the episode up to indigestion from some Chinese food he'd eaten too close to match time. They dressed and hurried to beat the crowd. They were heels, so they had to park far away from the building or their car would have been destroyed. They slipped out of the building, running with their bags, zigzagging the 15 blocks to their car. Michelle felt sick again as they were driving. Frenchie pulled over to the side of the road so Michelle could stick his finger down his throat in order to throw up, but he collapsed again. Frenchie lifted him back into the car and raced to the nearest hospital. The orderlies who put Michelle on a gurney told Frenchie, "Your friend is dead." Michelle Martel was 34 years old, and his heart gave out. He was the first of my wrestling brothers to die. I was proud that he had his last real match with me, and that he smiled all the way through it. It was my 21st birthday, and I was finding out that the wrestling business would always be about the things I learned along the way. I had a non-refundable plane ticket to Chicago, so I left with the farmer's daughter. On the flight, she said her purse was in the overhead bin and asked, "Han, Would you mind buying me a drink? I figured, what the heck? I'd be staying at her house and eating her food. She had plenty of drinks. When we landed in Chicago, she said, "Wait here and I'll see if my dad's out front." I never saw her again. I had $2,000 in my pocket to show for what I went through in Puerto Rico, and I was afraid I'd be robbed in Chicago. The only images I knew of the city were of Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. I remember that Keith always said that if I was ever in a bind, I should go to the YMCA. I asked for directions at the airport, and I ended up at 2 a.m. on a train along with street urchins and the night shift. I guess I was a midnight cowboy, with my bull rider hat pulled down over my eyes. I got off at Wabash Avenue at 3 a.m. and carried my bags through deserted streets to the Y. The guy at the desk said check-in was in 3 hours and that the cheapest room was $8. I paid him and took the key, only to find the furniture was smashed, the mattress was slashed, and there was blood splattered everywhere. I went back downstairs and asked, "How much is your best room?" He said $24. I said fine and asked him to hold my bags. I backtracked a few blocks to a fancy hotel where I stretched out on a couch in a side lobby for a few hours until I could check in at the Y. I had a couple of days to kill in Chicago before my flight back to Calgary. On my first 4th of July in America, I ended up down by the railroad tracks behind the Y, with no shirt on, just my jeans and cowboy hat, trying to keep my tan and listening to hobos playing harmonica and singing the blues. I found a place where I could peek between tall buildings to see just enough of the fireworks to be impressed. On my last day, I bought a small portable TV. I thought I'd bring it back with me to plug into the cigarette lighter of Stu's van so the whole Stampede crew could watch Hockey Night in Canada as we zoomed across the prairies. I was on my way to my room with the TV when I was approached by a strange little guy who looked like Scrooge McDuck. Out of nowhere he started to tell me that I had a beautiful voice, and he kept insisting that he wanted to come to my room and teach me how to sing. I didn't want Scrooge McDuck, or anyone else, to know what room I was in because I was worried the TV would be stolen. But I was still too good-natured to be rude. I thought the only way to get rid of the guy was to follow him to his room, where he wanted to show me his scrapbooks. I could tell that he lived in that tiny room. There was a shelf full of dog-eared paperbacks mounted on the wall over his bed. We sat down on the bed and I was looking for my first opening to get out of there, images of Chicago serial killer John Wayne Gacy floating in my head. Scrooge plopped 3 big scrapbooks down on our laps and began flipping through pages of clippings and programs. Much to my surprise, he actually had been a singer when he had a life. He seemed harmless enough now that when I opened up the 3rd scrapbook I was stunned to see 2 men screwing on the cover of a gay magazine. He gently put his hand on my knee and asked, "Do you like?" In a recoil reaction, my fist smashed him right in the face, knocking him against the wall, bringing down the bookshelf and covering him with books. He lay there twitching, pretending to be out cold, with a deep, ugly cut oozing under his right eye. I felt bad that I hit him so hard, but I was never going to sing the way he wanted me to. I picked up my TV and left. The next day I was standing at the foot of the steps in front of Hart House, glad to be home in one piece. A few days later I was in Stu's kitchen when Aunt Joni phoned. Surprise, Smith and Maria were there. And surprise, again, they were married. My whole detour to Chicago turned out to have been for nothing after all. The look on my face didn't even come close to my poor mother's aghast expression.